Hello, you are listening to Quality Time, a podcast designed to support Nebraskan providers through their journey with Step Up to Quality. I am your host, Colleen Schmidt. Get ready to listen as we prepare to elevate each other as we step up to quality. Welcome back, listeners. Today we have a very special guest. Today I am speaking with Dr. Walter Gilliam. Dr. Gilliam is the Executive Director of the Buffett Early Childhood Institute. He is a leading expert in education, health, and mental health of young children. Additionally, Walter is the president of the board of directors of 0 to 3. So cool. So welcome, Walter. We're so happy to have you join us on our podcast today. We're so happy you're here.
Hi, Colleen. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, before we start, can you share with our listeners a little bit about your why? During season 1, we really kind of dove in and talked about our whys and why we do what we do in the field. So maybe share a little bit about your backstory that kind of led you to where you are today, and give us a little insight of how you became interested in supporting the early childhood workforce.
Wow. Well, thank you for that question. My backstory and my why might be a little bit of a story. So, please bear with me. And if I'm dragging on too long, just let me know. But it started a little over 30 years ago. I was a public school teacher in rural Kentucky, deep in the mountains where I grew up. And my wife was a teacher too. And we taught at a small K through 12 school. We graduated about 50 or 60 a year from the high school. But all the grades, kindergarten through 12, were in the same building. It was the kind of school where teachers referred to themselves as either teachers or grand teachers or great teachers, depending on how many generations of children they had taught. Some of them were teaching the children and had taught those children's parents and had taught those children's grandparents. That's the kind of school it was. We lived really close to it. Again, it was all the grades, K through 12, in one building. My wife was the biology, chemistry, and physics department, and I was the music department.
Oh,
and yeah, it was a blast being the music teacher. Anybody who gets a chance to experience that, it's just so fun to be so well regarded, because when you come down the hall and you're the music teacher, you're like this one person circus. And to all the kids and to all the teachers, you look like a cup of coffee. And so everybody thinks it's grand when the music teacher is there. So that was our life for a while, and we loved it. But during the time that we were both teaching there, 2 children committed suicide, and 1 student died in a moped accident in front of the school very late at night. And another student committed suicide her freshman year in college after she'd graduated the year before. And that was a lot of tragedy that the school was absorbing. And I wasn't really much of a music teacher during a lot of that. I was more like a grief counselor who didn't know what he was doing. Because that's a part of teaching. Sometimes you end up doing a gig you didn't really know you signed up for, simply because you find out just how important you are in the lives of children. And so it caused me to rethink really what I wanted to do with my life. And with Anita's blessing, we left, and I went back to graduate school in child psychology, and spent time on a grant working with preschool teachers, childcare providers, and Head Start teachers. I came there really concerned about children committing suicide in their adolescent years. But in the context of working with childcare providers and Head Start teachers, I became convinced of the importance of the upstream intervention and the important role that early educators and childcare providers and Head Start teachers and special ed teachers for preschoolers and early interventionists and all those people who play an important part in the lives of young children, the role that they play. These wonderful, amazing people who have devoted their lives to caring for other people's children.
Mm-hmm.
And the impact that they have, and that perhaps if I cared about these adolescents who might not be sure about their reason to live, maybe I should care about them all the more when they're babies, and to care about those who care for them. And it was really then in graduate school that I decided that the rest of my career was going to be in the service of these wonderful, amazing people who care for other people's babies for a living. That to the degree that they are healthy, that is the degree that our young children will be healthy. That that our children's cups are filled to the degree that some caregiver's cup is overflowing.
Mm. Wow. I love that quote you just said right there about making sure that our children's cups are filled and that our caregivers' cups are overflowing. I can't wait to dig into this episode with you and talk about the ones holding the babies and how we care for them too. But this is my favorite part of the podcast, Walter, because I knew none of that. Even with doing some research, I saw that you went to grad school and you earned that degree, but I didn't know the backstory of the why. So thank you for opening up and sharing that part of your story with us today. That's wonderful. And you're correct about the music teacher. You're the celebrity when you walk through the hallway. Everybody loves you. Everyone wants to say hi. That's very true.
It's a great gig. It was a great gig right out of college. I loved it.
Yeah, me too. So our theme for this season is advocacy. And through your extensive work that you have helped to advocate for our workforce, for our kids, for the community, and just with hearing your story, it just reiterates what an advocate you are. Can you share with our listeners what advocacy means to you?
Great question. When you have the best questions. So advocacy, I get what it means really is, giving support to somebody, giving voice to somebody. It's an interesting thing to think about advocacy in the early childhood field, because the early childhood field, they are all advocates by virtue of the nature of the work they do.
Yes.
Advocate for babies all the time. They are advocating for children all the time. They are seeing the world through the eyes of those little ones that they are caring for, and they're advocating for their families. They advocate for so many that I'm afraid that sometimes they forget to advocate for themselves.
Yes. Yes.
And when they think of advocacy, they might be thinking about, like, how do you advocate for the field? How do you advocate for yourself? And it makes sense that they would think about it that way, because oftentimes when we use the word advocacy, it conjures up, big things like campaigns and different policies. But the nature of advocacy itself should not be foreign to early care and education and child care providers, because that's what they do. They advocate, and advocacy can show up in all kinds of ways. It can show up in terms of just speaking up for somebody. Advocacy can show up in terms of asking somebody how they're doing and meaning it.
Mm-hmm.
Advocacy can show up in the form of talking to an elected official and saying, when was the last time you were in a child care program? Or talking about the importance of early care and education because of all that it does for our societies, because it does good things in the lives of children and families, all of our children and families, that it makes it possible for parents to be able to go to work, that it makes it possible for businesses and communities to be able to know that they will have reliable employees. It's good for local economies, that the child care industry itself is good for economies.
Yes.
People talk about the importance of early care and education because it allows individuals to be employed, and oftentimes they are specifically talking about the employability of women.
Mm-hmm.
But we tend to forget the fact that child care programs often also affect the employability of women because it's women working in them.
Yes.
They're employed, and so when thinking about, advocating for the field, I just hope folks don't forget that you can't advocate for the field without advocating for those who are providing the work inside of that field. That oftentimes we have historically devalued work that has been traditionally associated with women. And to be able to advocate for children and families is also to advocate for the important work in caring for them.
Listeners, you can't see me, but I am clapping for Walter because everything he just said, I just feel like I'm so grateful you're here to be this voice and share that sentiment. We had author Ray Pica on the podcast last season.
Ray, she's so lovely.
She's so lovely. She's the best. And she said exactly what you just said. She said, for too long, this has been considered women's work. And that is part of the reason why we need to advocate more and build up our workforce and support and use words that matter. But the other thing I noted when you were talking, Walter, was how you're explaining to our audience that just by simply doing the job you're doing, like just by the virtue of the nature of the work that you're doing, you are already an advocate for young children.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I want to go back to Ray Pica for a second. How is she? I haven't seen her in forever.
She's a joy. She's actually on this season as well. We talked her into coming back because her episode was so popular and she's so amazing. She's just always been a light in the field as far as drawing attention to things that aren't right and highlighting the important work that everyone does. She is the biggest cheerleader I've ever met of our workforce, and she just says it like it is. So
true.
All true. Shout out to Ray.
I'm so glad. Yeah, I'm so glad that you had her on the show. When you were talking about, like advocacy too, let me turn around something that I'd said earlier and just ask it as a question to your listeners. When was the last time that you had invited a decision maker into your program? Invite them. They need to see it. They need to see the nature of the work that you do to be able to understand how essential it is for everything else that's happening. You are the workforce behind all other workforces. And to the degree that our elected officials see that, that's the degree to which they can understand the importance of the nature of the work that you do. Invite them in. If you need bait, have some cameras there. They love showing up for cameras. So, just have some cameras, invite a newspaper, and have them come over and just kind of see what it's like to be an early educator. I bet they do it, but I bet they won't do it if you don't think to invite them.
Yes, that's good advice. We had 2 home providers, family childcare home providers from Lincoln on this season, and they shared that same idea of if we don't ask, they won't come. And they'd actually take their children to the Capitol, and the kids know the senators. They say, that's my state senator. And they introduce themselves and put a face to, who we're actually working for here and what we're working for. So, I love that you mentioned that.
And I bet those senators love it too. They to be recognized even by their youngest of citizens.
Yes, youngest constituents.
It's never too early to start, with the civics lessons,
That's right.
Giving children an opportunity to see their elected officials, but also giving those elected officials an opportunity to see what childcare looks like and what the importance of childcare is, and that it's not easy work. But to do it right is very difficult, and it's labor intensive. And that as a result, it needs to be supported. It is an infrastructure. In Nebraska, many Nebraskans needed 2 things to get to work today: a road to drive on and somebody to take care of the kids.
Yep.
And without that, they would not have been able to go to work. Our elected officials need to see that too.
And I think when you talk about it being labor intensive, something that I always say to our providers is your job is physically, mentally, emotionally challenging, still joyful and so important. But those 3 things tend to be true for a lot of folks. So I do want to pivot a little bit and let's talk some about the ones holding the babies. You mentioned that sometimes something we forget in our advocacy story is advocating for ourselves. We're really good at advocating for the kids, but as a workforce, sometimes it's hard to advocate for ourselves. And we've talked a lot on the podcast about compassion fatigue, burnout, self-care, all of these kind of things that can impact how we show up. Recently, I had watched a clip of you discussing teacher stress and expulsion rates, Walter, that was shared from 0 to 3. But can you explain a bit about the work you have done with supporting teacher mental health and how it can impact our kids? And how does that advocacy impact our providers in the field?
I've been doing a lot of work in the past on preschool expulsion and suspension. And one of the early findings that we had was that teacher job stress was a significant predictor of expulsion and suspension. And so was teacher depression. And during the course of the pandemic, there was a lot for early educators to be stressed out about or depressed over. As a matter of fact, just a couple of months into the pandemic, we were collecting data on the well-being of early care and education providers. We actually started out the work just 2.5, 3 months into the pandemic as a way to try to measure COVID-19 transmission in childcare programs across the country in order to be able to monitor whether or not this was a safe thing that we were asking early educators to do. You know, sometimes during scary times, we have to ask people to do brave things. But for us to ask early educators to be taking care of children in childcare programs during the pandemic without ever looking to see exactly what kind of risk are we asking, it felt like an intolerable, Colleen. And so we started doing these studies, and in the context of that, we started also collecting data on their general well-being, their mental health, their physical health, their financial health. You know, and a lot of the stuff that we found was quite surprising. In our first wave of data, just 2 or 3 months into the pandemic, we had like 83,000 early care and education providers participating in this. And they were from all the states and most all the counties in all the states. And just a couple of months into the pandemic, 46% of our early care and education providers, our child care providers, were screening positive for potentially diagnosable levels of depression. Now, I don't mean 46% were sad every once in a while, or 46% felt a little down. I'm saying 46% screening at a level on a measure that's used to estimate population depression rates. 46% screening at in a level that would suggest that they're diagnosably depressed. And by a year and a half into the pandemic, 46% became 56%.
Wow.
More than half of the workforce potentially diagnosably depressed. And there was a lot of reasons why that seemed to be true. What we also learned in the context of collecting all this data is that about 35% of them had lost their job at the beginning of the pandemic. And those who hadn't lost their job, their programs were open or closed, and they were financially not sure about the future. Even before the pandemic, early educators don't get paid enough. We've never been paid enough. And I think an awful lot of it boils down to the fact that we just exploit them. We know that they do it because they love children and families. And that is a wonderful thing. But I'm afraid that the other side of it is we exploit that. And we know that they will do it for less than they are actually worth. Now, and during the course of the pandemic, that became difficult for many of them to manage. I don't know anyone who goes into childcare because they think they're going to get rich.
Right.
But they do need to be able to eat, and they need to be able to pay the rent, and they need to be able to take care of their own children too. And many of them were struggling to do that during much of the pandemic. And on top of it, they had their own set of worries about the pandemic and concerns. And on top of that too, they had the worries and concerns and the upset of all the children they care for. Young children, just like all other humans, have a way of putting all their worries and concerns of their family and their community into a backpack, into their childcare program or their school, and then dumping it out on the table for the adult to sort through. But during the course of the last 3 or 4 months, many of our childcare providers were literally on their last nerve too. And that was an awful lot for them to be able to manage. At the beginning of the pandemic, most of those, this was from the data that we were collecting. We've not collected data on like about 126,000 early care and education providers across the nation. At the beginning of the pandemic, most of those who left the field left because they were older and were close to retirement and were afraid that they might get sick.
Yes.
After the first year, it turned out to be mostly those who were younger, especially those managing stress and depression. In other words, in the first year, we lost most of our wisdom from the field. And the years after, we've been losing most of our future. And that's why I think that if we really care about our children, if we really care about these young families, we have to care about the general well-being of those who care for them. That they have it rough. They had it rough during the course of the pandemic. They're still having it rough. They need to be compensated better. They need to be provided benefits. They need to be provided respite care. It's amazing how many childcare providers there are out there who can't take time off to take their own child to the doctor because there would be nobody there to watch the children in their childcare program, especially those who are running childcare programs out of their home. You know, and just even for a community to be able to open up its substitute teacher pool that they use for K through 12 for the use of childcare providers, that in and of itself would be huge. Yeah. It was interesting at the beginning of the pandemic that the CDC was advocating that childcare providers should be able to be prioritized to get vaccination, along with teachers. And many states did prioritize teachers,
right,
and forgot to include early educators. Just little simple things like that to remember that those who care for our littlest are also important too, and should be remembered when thinking about the well-being of those who educate families and children in our communities.
I absolutely agree with everything you say. That data feels very sobering. Like when you go through that and you kind of list out, 46% when we started, and then a year in, it jumped up to 56%. That showed stress and depression. My thing when the pandemic first hit, I really was optimistic that here's our moment. Everybody's going to see how important birth through 5 is. And here it comes because look, they need us and they're all still showing up and having to do the work. And then after a year or two, things just kind of went back to normal and no knight on a white horse came. No one came to highlight us or save the day or really amplify our workforce in a big major way, and nothing really changed. I am an optimistic girl, Dr. Gilliam, and I do believe that having conversations about equitable and fair wages and pay and benefits and all of this is such a good thing to talk about. What I'm going to throw you a curveball, if you don't mind. What I'd love to know is, what do we do with this data? Where do we go from here? How do we start supporting those who are caring for our youngest?
I really think that when it comes down to it, we have to subsidize childcare the same way that we subsidize all other things that are infrastructural in nature. At the beginning of this, I was comparing childcare to our roads. You need childcare, you need roads to be able to get to work. One of those we subsidize. Mm-hmm. The other we don't. We subsidize all kinds of things in the United States. We subsidize corn and dairy and oil. We subsidize our road system. We subsidize K through 12.
Yep.
And what is the largest provider of childcare in the United States? The public schools. Mm-hmm. You might not think of K through 12 as childcare, but it is. Mm-hmm. And yet we don't subsidize childcare when provided to children younger than 5, even though it absolutely needs to be in order for parents to be able to get to work.
Yep.
So as a result, we depend on exploitation. I was on a call and had a feeling very similar to what you were describing, Colleen. It was near the beginning of the pandemic, and somebody made a comment very similar to what you had said that said, maybe right now, at least people will see and understand the importance of childcare. And I remember feeling very similar to how you said you felt. Well, maybe they're right. Maybe now people will finally, understand that. And then I thought about it a little bit more. And I thought, I'm not so sure that that's true because, people rediscover the importance of childcare every time it snows. When the schools close down due to snow days, people realize the importance of childcare. It's not like people don't realize the importance of childcare. I think people do realize that it's important. But when something is important as a commodity, either as a material commodity or as a service, and we respect those who provide that service, we negotiate for it. But when we value a commodity or a service and we don't respect those who provide for it, we don't negotiate for it. We just exploit.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately that is the thing that has to change, that we need to be able to band together into a bigger, more inclusive voice about the importance of the work of childcare. And that needs to include those who are providing the care, but it also needs to involve the business community that is highly dependent upon childcare in order to function. It needs to include the educational system that is also dependent upon childcare for their teachers to come to work, but also dependent upon childcare because childcare is the feeder schools of the schools.
Right.
All of these things tell me that there is a much bigger set of beneficiaries of childcare out there that have not been adequately tapped into a larger, more vocal community of advocacy for early care and education. And that's where we need to be focusing. We subsidize all kinds of stuff, and we can certainly subsidize the well-being of our children and our families and those amazing people who keep businesses open by providing childcare to others. When I first came to Omaha, I came here from Connecticut, and I'd been here now for about a year and a half. And not long after I came here, I went to the College World Series for the first time. And I was at the College World Series, and I was sitting there and striking up a conversation with somebody between innings. Her name is Stacy, and I found out that she is a home-based childcare provider in Grand Island. And so we're talking. As we're talking, I asked her to tell me about the children in her care, and she lit up, as early educators and childcare providers do when they're talking about their children and families. You know that look I'm talking about,
Yes.
Colleen, where they talk about them like they're their own children because they kind of are. And she was talking about these children in her care and just glowing about it. And I said, well, tell me more about who the families are. And she said, well, all the families are teachers. I said, really? She said, they're all public school teachers. And I said, well, how many children do you have? She said, 10. And I said, how many teachers? And she said, well, 7, because some of the children are siblings. And I said, well, wow, Stacy, you're the teacher that makes 7 of the teachers possible.
Yes.
And she says she hadn't really thought of it that way before, but that she will. And I asked her, well, how do you make ends meet? And what is it like to keep this home-based childcare program open? Is it easy? And she goes, oh goodness, no, it's not easy. And I said, well, how do you do it? And she said, I couldn't do it. I take a loss. And I said, well, then how do you make it happen? And she said, my husband Jamie's got a decent job.
Right.
He subsidizes my early childhood habit. This is important work that she's doing. She's keeping the public schools open. And God bless that there's a Stacy there to do that work and a Jamie there to subsidize it on the side. But we cannot afford in this state or any other state to build a system on the hope and a prayer that a Stacy and a Jamie happen to be there.
Absolutely. I think the way that you phrased that probably made her have a paradigm shift in thinking about what she does and how she serves her community at large. And you're absolutely right that we need to band together and see all educators as valuable and as important as those who work in K through 12. We need to start focusing that attention on birth through 5 so we can all have a seat at the table that is equitable and fair. I love everything you said. Literally everything. I just could sit here for 2 more hours and listen to you just go. I'm like, just go, Walter. Just talk about all of it because it's all very true.
I'd love to listen to you too. I mean, I can't think of anything that I would rather do than sit around and talk about these incredible people who care for other people's children. So if you got the 2 hours, I do.
Let's do it. I think our listeners would tune in too. I think they'd be here the whole time. I agree with you. I can just go on and on and on about the importance of our workforce and who we are and what we do and how we do it. But I think the big picture takeaway that I'm taking from our conversation, and I'm hoping that our listeners are too, is what it boils down to is a bit of exploitation and looking for ways to start working together so we are all seen as valuable members of education. And that to me is the big heavy lift of advocacy, but sometimes it doesn't have to be that heavy of a lift. And you've already shared some of these strategies earlier where it doesn't have to be as formal as you think. But really thinking about how can we apply those strategies in order to provide better quality care for our kids. So I'm just going to ask you, Walter, if you have any final kind of wrap-up thoughts, words of encouragement or wisdom or fire that you want to give our listeners in regards to what advocacy is and what they mean to our community.
Invite decision makers into your program. Invite the community. Invite community leaders into your program. Make sure that they understand and see the value of the work that you do every day. Write op-eds describing the nature of the work that you do and why what you do is important. Important for the educational benefit, important because of the labor support that it provides and allows people to be able to go to work, the importance of it to businesses. If you feel intimidated about writing an op-ed, contact a college student in a journalism program. I bet they would help with that. They'd love it. Contact a business leader. Find somebody like-minded to you who can talk about it from the opposite side and write it together. What else can you do? You could find other people who are also childcare providers and host some kind of an event where you all can get together and support each other. I mean, I have nothing against the idea of self-help, but I'm saying this as a former licensed psychologist. I'm a little worried about self-help because sometimes what self-help basically means is we're going to set up a system by which you are abused and neglected and then teach you how to take care of yourself after we abuse and neglect you. Self-help is difficult to do, but helping each other is easier, especially when you're talking about early educator and childcare providers. They oftentimes will neglect themselves, but by nature, they love to care for others. Get together as a group, care for each other. It will probably feel more natural to you anyway, and it'll allow you to be able to see that there are others out there too who have an early childhood habit just like you and are struggling through all the challenges of it. And on top of all of that too, go to some conferences about early childhood. They happen here in the state from time to time. It gives you an opportunity to be able to see that you're part of a field, that you're a part of like-minded people. And then from time to time, you'll see that there'll be advocacy efforts at a bigger scale that you might also want to be able to participate in. See yourself as part of a field. You are doing something incredibly important. You are taking care of the next generation of children and families. You are the schools before children get to school. You are a support for families so that they can actually be able to go to work. You keep economies moving by making sure that businesses have employable individuals. And you are doing something incredibly important for your local community. All of that are things that you are doing. You are part of a field, and you are important to all of us.
I think that is the best way to sum that up that we've heard all year, Walter. See yourself as part of the field, listeners. Please see yourselves as valuable advocates. And Dr. Gilliam, thank you again so much for joining and sharing your message, sharing your voice. You are an inspiration. We're so lucky to have you in Nebraska. We're so lucky to get you.
I'm delighted to be here. And Colleen, thank you so much for what you do, for giving this kind of a venue to early educators and for giving them voice and for speaking to them and with them and for them. For all that you do, Colleen, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, and thank you, everyone, for joining again and spending quality time with us. Please join next time as we chat about future topics to support our Nebraskan providers on their journey with Step Up to Quality. Until next time, bye-bye.